Welcome to Maintain Compliance while servicing a new generation of digital-first customers. My name is Christina Wong, and I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager for Regulated Industries at DocuSign. I'll be your moderator today. Next slide. We all know that our world has become more digital, where consumers' expectations are changing to expect mobile experiences, and at the same time, global compliance has become more complex and rigorous. Key to meeting these demands is digitally transforming, being able to address this new normal to remain competitive, and particularly around engaging younger generations as they're starting to enter the workforce, gain purchasing power, and being much needed for the life sciences clinical trial processes. According to PwC, 93% of pharmaceutical and life sciences executives agree that including digital elements in clinical trials were important to their company's pipeline for the next 5 years. This is what we're here to discuss today. Next slide. We'll discuss some best practices and hear from Kimberly from DKMS about a great case study about how they are adapting to the new normal. Our first speaker, Kimberly Srinivasan, is going to discuss how they adapted to this digital world with Gen Z in mind. Our second speaker is Michael Yatsko, Senior Director of Compliance at DocuSign. Please be sure to put any of your questions in the chat bar so that we can answer it in real time. We are here and available to answer any questions you have in chat. So before I launch into the presentation, I want to just do a quick introduction to DocuSign. Many of us know DocuSign as being a main e-signature solution, but we've grown from there into providing a broad solution that helps you prepare, sign, act, and manage on all of your documents and agreements. We've created specific products that are specialized for the life sciences industry. For eSign, we have a product for meeting the FDA's 21 CFR Part 11 regulations, as well as GXP standards. And then for the preparation and management of documents, we have a contract lifecycle management solution that includes AI functionality, and it allows you to automate redlining, have pre-approved clauses from legal, and be able to speed up contract close times by being able to automate a lot of these manual processes. And once the documents are signed and approved, they can live in a central repository in which you can use AI analytics to find your documents quickly. So we've seen throughout COVID-19, next slide, that having a solution like DocuSign that is adaptable and flexible is really critical to meeting needs that may arise. There are two particular case studies that kind of highlight how DocuSign was able to adapt to the COVID-19 crisis and this new normal. The first one is around telehealth. We know telehealth is here to stay. We worked with TeleDoctor24, which is a European medical services app that allows European patients to receive telehealth and receive electronic prescriptions. And this was EIDAS compliant, in which they use QES signatures along with our product, DocuSign Identify. The second story is around helping a large healthcare provider in San Diego, California, conduct COVID-19 clinical research studies using our 21 CFR Part 11 module. They were able to receive all of the patient consents in a safe way without ever having to see the patient in person. So as you can see here on the right-hand side, these are just a bunch of our top use cases that DocuSign was used for and continues to be used for maintaining business continuity. So again, when you're working with a solution like ours, we can help you quickly adapt and innovate to meet these new needs and challenges that may unexpectedly arise. And we are here today to listen to Kimberly, next slide, who is a quality assurance consultant with DKMS in New York City. She has worked with DKMS New York City from 2017 to 2020, and she now consults for them. During her tenure, she contributed to closing the gap between stem cell donors and life-saving transplants by introducing DocuSign's 21 CFR Part 11 module into the donation workup process. I'll now hand it over to Kimberly.
Thank you so much, Christina, for your introduction. Next slide. Again, my name is Kimberly, and today I'm going to be sharing with you all how DKMS has leveraged DocuSign for faster blood stem cell transplants. Next slide. So DKMS was actually started in 1991 in Germany. It's an acronym for the German phrase meaning German Bone Marrow Donor Center. The mission is to provide a second chance at life by recruiting unrelated blood stem cell donors for patients suffering from blood cancers and other serious, often life-threatening diseases. DKMS is the second largest blood stem cell registry in the world, comprised of over 10.5 million registered donors, and we're responsible for triaging 38% of transplants worldwide. There are currently 7 international registries located in Germany, the UK, Poland, the US, Chile, India, and most recently, South Africa. Since DKMS US operations began as a 501c3 company in 2004, we've triaged 4,556 collections, with over 370 of those occurring in 2020 in spite of the circumstances. Next slide. So this is a simplified map of how unrelated blood stem cell donation works. DKMS begins by actively recruiting interested, primarily young individuals for the registry across the nation. 1 swab is gathered from the inside of each cheek for a total of 2 swabs, which are then sent to DKMS's state-of-the-art laboratory in Germany for typing for human leukocyte antigen, or HLA. The HLA profile and other pertinent anonymized information are then made available in the DKMS registry. When a transplant center preliminarily identifies a donor with a desirable HLA profile and other qualities, the transplant center notifies DKMS, who then contacts the donor. Confirmatory testing is completed for those donors to ensure that they are indeed a match. If the transplant center chooses a donor for transplant, the donor then enters the workup stage. And this is the stage where the donor signs informed consents and other documents, their past and current health are assessed, and DKMS medical directors determine suitability and eligibility of each donor. It's at this stage where DKMS begins to assist in the procurement of blood products. And as such, good manufacturing practices, good tissue practices apply, and so does 21 CFR Part 11 for electronic records and signatures. Next slide. Of course, there are a variety of additional operations that occur that's surrounding the triaging of blood stem cell collections. These include donor drives initiated by patients and families, marketing efforts, and data management. They all contribute to the DKMS mission. And it might go without saying, but these historically have been very paper-heavy operations. Next slide. In fact, even as late 2018, most of DKMS operations were operating solely on paper. We have volunteer non-disclosure agreements and patient marketing disclosures. Our donor consents and medical clearance forms were posing difficulties for our offsite medical directors and young donors without printer access. We have donor marketing disclosures and donor international country transfers, which were also conducted on paper. While we're waiting for paper to be printed and signed and scanned, this is all costing time, which leads to negative patient outcomes. At the end of the day, these patients don't have time to waste. Next slide. So keeping in mind the previously detailed operations, this is how the DKMS journey with DocuSign came to fruition over time. Product discovery really began in the summer of 2018. Transplant centers at that time were requesting younger and younger donors because younger donors have been associated with more positive patient outcomes after transplant. Typically, the most desirable donors are between the ages of 18 and 24 years old. And as you can imagine, historically, paperwork has been pretty difficult to obtain from this demographic. DKMS started by transforming our workup process and our quality management system in August of 2018. We used primarily the 21 CFR Part 11 product to get our donors, employees, and medical directors signing electronically. This was really the priority. But as you can see by the timeline, the rest of the operations followed in line over the following 2.5 years, which has culminated in exclusively electronic records, where DocuSign documents currently act as EHRs in their entirety. Next slide. Now, DocuSign was, of course, not the only electronic signing product we explored. There are a variety of factors that went into the decision. DKMS donors and employees had been asking for electronic signatures for years by the time 2018 rolled around, but providing a signing method that fit with both DKMS processes and federal compliance standards was proving difficult to find. Luckily, DocuSign's 21 CFR Part 11 product provides a customizable, user-friendly tool that also fit with our nonprofit budget. The non-Part 11 product is also used now for volunteer NDAs, patient marketing disclosures, and country transfers. Next slide. And of course, best practices must also be followed as well as we participate in the manufacturing of blood products. So many of you might be familiar with good documentation practices, good manufacturing practices, and of course, good tissue practices. These are applicable as soon as workup starts on a donor, as soon as the transplant center decides, I want to send this person to transplant. DocuSign checks all of these requirements for DKMS. Next slide. Now, as those of us in healthcare and life sciences know, validation of computer systems and programs used in manufacturing is required. As a nonprofit with limited resources, we decided to perform our own initial validation, and we've devised an ongoing validation protocol. Initially, we used DocuSign's educational materials to get going, including the 21 CFR Part 11 white paper and the self-paced DocuSign University training modules. We then devised a process and created and tested the templates with test envelopes. Finally, we authored an SOP with instructional appendices for DocuSign use prior to training our end users. Now, DocuSign releases product update notes periodically. So for ongoing validation, we review these release notes and complete an internal change request form. We evaluate each update for risk related to our use. We also run any test envelopes tests for updates that might impact our use cases directly. The change request form and any test envelopes are retained together, and documented end user training occurs if any relevant changes occur that might require that end user training. So this is our continuous validation process. Next slide. Since DKMS US went into production with DocuSign at the beginning of November 2018, we've seen dramatic improvements across all operations, but this slide is specific to our donor-related impact. So prior to DocuSign, each donor had to provide DKMS with handwritten signatures, either via email, fax, scanning the documents, or even in some desperate situations, phone pictures of our documentation. Donors had to be sure to return the documents with clearly legible headers and footers to preserve document control, and if these weren't visible, we had to obtain new copies from the donor. Additionally, sometimes donors tried to apply their own non-compliant electronic signatures. So again, we had to retain that documentation a second time. Donors often delayed returning documentation because they didn't have access to printers. If donors returned consents after their physical examination dates, a critical protocol deviation was assessed. Our critical consent deviations numbered 10% of our collections in Q1 of 2018. Once DocuSign was implemented, though, we've seen really dramatic improvement in all of these areas. Over 90% of our donors now opt to use DocuSign. We've had 0 critical consent deviations post-implementation over the past 2.5 years. And we had 18 total documentation-related deviations from January through October 2018 that could have been avoided using DocuSign. But now we haven't had any of those documentation-related deviations. And of course, we've dramatically reduced our paper. Next slide. A second key impact for DKMS operations was that on medical clearance. Prior to DocuSign, our off-site DKMS medical directors provided an email statement of a donor's suitability and eligibility, then provided wet signatures on paperwork via FedEx. This left us open to HIPAA liabilities if documentation was ever lost in transit. But now our MDs provide instant compliance signatures, saving our FedEx costs, time, and risk. We've gone from having 34 days for a wet signature down to less than 24 hours for a compliance signature on our donor documentation. But most importantly, DocuSign has really provided DKMS with improved capacity for instantaneous donor clearance for very urgent patient cases that have been accelerated by their transplant physicians. Next slide. Now, like all organizations, DKMS hurriedly transitioned to remote work at the beginning of 2020. But this wasn't as difficult for us as maybe some organizations because DocuSign had already been in use across the organization at that point. We were provided with uninterrupted seamless transition to remote work, uninterrupted stem cell collections around the world because of DocuSign. In fact, after the rousing success of our paperless work over the last 14 months, DKMS has made the decision to transition entirely to EHRs. So DocuSign documents now compose each donor's EHR and each donation's batch record. Marketing and recruiting also continued remotely, in part due to our electronic forms on DocuSign. So in the end, DocuSign is now a truly integral part in helping the 70,000 people worldwide each year who are told that they need a blood stem cell transplant from an unrelated person. Next slide. So to summarize, DocuSign has really reduced donor barriers by allowing donors to complete all of their documentation at all stages of donation on any device with an internet connection. We've seen faster medical clearance by our offsite medical directors, which has increased speed from donor request through stem cell collection, ultimately providing products to patients faster. These points are truly demonstrated by this photo here from our annual Big Love Gala, last held in person in May of 2019. On the left is patient Carson Lennington Stewart, who was diagnosed with lymphoma one day before his 9th birthday. After chemotherapy and a cancer relapse, he received a blood stem cell transplant from DKMS US donor Samuel Beckett, who's pictured here on the right. The transplant was completed successfully in 2017, and the two met for the first time at the gala in front of 900 guests who shared in their joy and emotional reunion. Our next in-person gala is actually scheduled for October this year in New York City, and hopefully we might see some of you there. So thank you very much for allowing me this opportunity to share how DKMS and DocuSign have become great partners.
Thank you, Kimberly. This was really fascinating, and now I'm going to introduce Michael Yatsko. Next slide. Senior Director of Compliance at DocuSign. As you heard from Kimberly, there is a lot of ability to digitize the process, while also there's a lot of scrutiny to make sure that you're compliant. So things have changed because of COVID-19 and the pressure to become more digital and have that digital transformation across your entire organization, such as what Kimberly has demonstrated, ranging from workup plans all the way to marketing, can be quite difficult when you're trying to make sure that you're compliant. And so that is what Michael is here to chat about today. He is an accomplished leader with 20 years of experience at SaaS companies. And at DocuSign, he has advocated strategic visions, got executive leadership buy-in, and is our expert in compliance. So before I turn it over to him, I want to remind you all to please send in your questions through the chat function. We are here live, ready to answer any questions you may have. So Michael, please share your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. DocuSign has been offering our Part 11 module for over 6 years. And in that time that we've been offering it, we've seen a dramatic increase in the usage of that across the healthcare and life science industry itself. In 2020, with the introduction of with COVID ravaging the world itself, we saw a massive uptake from healthcare and life science in organizations in using and having to go to digital transformation. The big problems that we had was that within healthcare and life science organizations, it is a very manually based, paper-intensive process where people were assumed to be in the office. And with things such as government mandated shutdowns, people having to work from home, and in those type of scenarios where you're at home and you don't necessarily have access to a printer or to a fax machine, the way that they've normally done business has to change. And so as part of all of these type of things, this adaptation of this has really seen this dramatic increase within the need to digitize the current manual-based processes that are there today. DocuSign has been key to that by being able to do things, completely remotely through the cloud services that we offer itself. So with that, we were able to sit there and, with our platform itself, take the current existing based manual processes and transform that into a digital workflow where that would allow people to sit there and visualize, to standardize their documentation, create a predictable workflow and sequencing within that workflow itself, and track the transaction through completion. Once the transaction's been completed, people can download and save that document into their repositories. Next slide, please. Along with this, one of the challenges with the healthcare and life science organizations in general is that the need to be able to validate the solution. Unlike other regulated industries, which do need to sit there and do some checks on DocuSign itself, the introduction of good practices really necessitates that health and life science organizations spend time and effort to manage their supply chain and be sure that all of the quality elements that they're held accountable to, that they can hold their vendors accountable to. With that, then, the auditing challenges really increased in 2020 due to COVID as well. Historically, health and life science organizations would sit there and send an auditor on site to a vendor's location. There would be a multi-day audit for that. We would go over and have to produce documentation on demand, when the auditor is there, similar to how a regulator would demand the same for their, from the health and life science organization itself. And we had to sit there and be able to, come up with an agreement in place for these type of things, for the quality itself. So for this itself, one of the things that we were having to position ourselves with in 2020 was the ability to kind of change this to a remote workplace or a remote audit itself. So rather than having the health and life science organization show up on site, we were able to sit there and switch to a video audit. Now, this is new for the health and life science organizations because usually within their good practices, that was one of the requirements within that standard was to sit there and be on site. But obviously, due to COVID, they couldn't be there. So we were able to sit there and host, numerous customer audits in a quick time frame, so that we could sit there and help those customers complete the documentation and that they needed to do to prove out to prove out their adherence to good practices itself. Now, as part of that, the health and life science organizations are responsible for producing their own validation plan. They are the ones regulated by the FDA, and they're the ones who have to prove that the solution meets their good practices. Now, DocuSign was able to help with that by providing and aligning our software development lifecycle and our operation practices, and aligning that with the GXP standards themselves. So by doing so, we were able to provide the documentation and explain this in a way for the health and life science organizations to update their validation plans in a timely manner. Now, along with this, something new was introduced in 2020 as well. Part of the good practices now there's always been an element of doing more and more quality agreements where that quality is being memorialized within a specific agreement. And what we've seen, especially in 2020, was the rise of the quality agreement, where numerous companies were now asking us to make that commitment in this agreement so that we would be able to prove to them through the artifacts that we have to produce that we're aligning with their good practices as well. Next slide, please. And for compliance, it is a shared responsibility between the health and life science organizations and DocuSign itself. So overall, the customer is responsible for identifying the regulated use cases that they do have. DocuSign is a platform, and as a cloud service, it can handle a lot of both. It can handle both regulated and non-regulated use cases. The customer is ultimately responsible for identifying the regulated use cases that actually need the Part 11 module, and for doing things such as working to put together the validation plan and saying how they are going to how they're going to make sure that the Part 11 module aligns with their good tissue practices, their good laboratory practices, their good manufacturing practices, whatever GXP standard they have to go by. The customer is also responsible for auditing DocuSign and being able to make sure that we comply with what they need to from a quality perspective. DocuSign is also then doing and being able to provide the solution. So we provide multiple solutions for this. So Christina mentioned early on, e-signature has been our traditional product itself, but that has been expanding out into a multi-product company where we offer things like contract lifecycle management. We offer Insights, which is an analyzed product, and other types of products that can be used as part of within the good practices for health and life science customers. The other thing that we do is we help customers align their validations plans by providing our documentation to them. So we help guide those customers through things like our Part 11 assurance packets, our white papers, meeting with people, with DocuSign employees to walk the quality people through the necessary steps to create and execute their validation plan. And finally, we sit there and we are open to participating and support customer audits. So we're open to having the customers come in, participate in these remote audits, and when we get back to the office, in-person audits for one or multiple days, depending on the situation. Next slide, please. So the big challenges that have always faced the cloud service providers such as DocuSign and the and health and life science organizations has been there's been a number of differences which have made compliance difficult over the years. One of the big differences that has happened is that is based off of terminology. In the 6.5 years that DocuSign has been doing the Part 11 module itself, we've had to reorientate our terminology that we use internally towards the health and life sciences terminology. Quality traditionally at DocuSign had been part of the software quality process, meaning just a simple QA script. And then within the regulated industries itself, we've had to kind of adapt that to having our installation qualification, operational qualification, and performance qualification test scripts align with the definition of what quality means to a health and life science organization. The other things that we have had to change is that we're relying on the validation approaches itself. So when we talk about validation is just more than just software itself. It also gets into the policies and procedures, training on those policies and procedures, and being able to maintain incidents, for the corrective and preventive actions are all new things that have been introduced into DocuSign because of our work with the health and life science organizations over the years. With this, though, by doing this, now that we are at this point, we are getting a lot more agile and being able to handle overcoming the objections that health and life science organizations have traditionally had with on-premise solutions or with their current manual processes itself, because we've gained the expertise within the industry to be able to articulate how we align ourselves with their GXP practices itself. And finally, the big lesson that we learned here is that everything needs to be documented. And with that, it's not just about the requirements and the test cases as the baseline for this itself. We realize that we need to document everything in terms of the policies and procedures, our training, our training materials, training records for what our users have to go through and what our internal employees have to go through, and documenting things like the customer's feedback, into these CAPA tickets that we can then use and process internally. Okay. Next slide. Okay.
Thank you, Michael and Kimberly. We do have time for a few questions. So the first one that I have here is, the European regulatory standards are very stringent when it comes to documentation. How is DKMS and DocuSign adapting to these requirements? And if you can also speak to GDPR. Kimberly, do you want to start?
Sure. So we, being founded in Germany, our IT group, GDPR coming down years before it was actually put into play. And so they prepared our internal registry for GDPR compliance. And so the registry and our proprietary software is compliant with those laws. Our processes were also updated to accommodate our European donors should they request to be removed from the registry. But in terms of securing DocuSign, and at the time we were also interested in electronic quality management systems. And so the question from Germany was, well, if we want to use this, if you are really successful, how does this match, is this compliant with GDPR? And the answer was a resounding yes. Companies as large as DocuSign with such multinational, truly global presence does all of their research ahead of time. And so when you secure a product like DocuSign and you say, look, we need 21 CFR compliance, we need GDPR compliance if we want to go into our European registries, and you trust that you're getting something compliant. And so that's part of the reason that we ended up going with DocuSign as opposed to a competitor, because we knew that we could scale it up and we knew that we could scale it for compliance.
Thank you. Michael?
So DocuSign has addressed this in several different ways. The first is that DocuSign has, years ago launched European data centers. So we've been very conscious of putting and maintaining the data within the continental European, within continental Europe itself. So we have data centers within Germany, Amsterdam, and Paris, or in France. The second thing is, from an EU perspective, we are aligned with the European Medicines Agencies and the Good Manufacturing Practices Annex 11, or Good Clinical Practices Annex 11, which is very, very similar to the FDA Part 11 itself. So through just a little bit of an uplift, we were able to assert our compliance against the Annex 11 regulation itself. And finally, within Europe itself, electronic signatures are regulated. There is a basic electronic signature that can happen without any regulations itself, but then there's an advanced electronic signature and a qualified electronic signature. DocuSign invested in acquisitions to be able to produce those type of signatures, and is registered as a trust service provider within Europe itself, and has a program to work with other trust service providers in continental Europe if an organization wants to work with a particular vendor itself.
Great. So we have time for one last question. Kimberly, can you just sum up quickly around as the life sciences industry needs to digitize, and in particular, younger generations are becoming more important, what are some of those final words that you have for them in trying to make sure that they are able to recruit and engage and maybe potentially enroll younger generations in virtual clinical trials? Just generally, any last words for companies trying to figure out how do they really be able to modernize to meet this new generation?
I think what I would say to those companies who are maybe a little nervous or who are holding out or looking for the right time is that don't wait. The time is now. Regardless of the type of process that you're transforming, whether you're enrolling for clinical trials, whether you're pharma manufacturing, regardless of the type of transformation you're looking at, digitization takes a lot of work and a lot of time. If nothing else, then just to comply with the laws and make sure that you're doing so properly. So I would say if you want to be competitive moving forward, start now, get a jump on it. Don't wait for something like COVID to happen, where you could be like a DKMS and just, have seamless transition with your processes that are already online, and that you can continue enrolling patients, or you can continue signing documents even though people are working remotely. I think it's really important to have something at least in the pipeline at this point, because it takes time to make those adaptations. So that's what my final words would be. Don't wait. Definitely get started now if you haven't already.
Thank you. And Michael, last words around when these companies are looking to digitally transform, it's scary. I mean, there's a lot of trust in paper, and being able to say, hey, I do think going digital is necessary, and how to get over some of these compliance, hurdles. I'd say any last words of some best practices or advice about companies who are starting to really tackle going digital and making sure that they're compliant?
Sure. So it's I would say, to embrace this particular change itself. So when you're trying to go from these paper-based systems, being able to go and spend the time and effort to identify what is the use case that you're looking for, what is the documentation that you need, how are you going to archive that document and provide that document upon request. That stuff needs to be planned ahead of time so that you can sit there and understand where things are in the process itself. But once you do that and you have to go through that digitization process, it becomes much easier if you've already know how you want to approach that documentation to begin with. Once you do go through that digitization process, you'll realize how much easier it is to actually do things electronically than to sit there and keep that paper, store it, ship it off to third-party locations for long-term storage, scan it into other systems. Your life will become easier over time as you embrace the change early on.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much to our panelists for today, and just wanted to make sure that you all stay in touch. We have Michael's expertise in these two white papers that are on our website. We also have Kimberly's expertise in our new case study featuring DKMS as well on our website. So please be sure to go to DocuSign.com for our follow-up resources. And you also have our contact information emails right there. So thank you again, and I hope you have a good rest of the conference.